Did you see that? I swear that was a shark fin. As divers, one of the things that my wife and I like to do when we're on dive trips is watch movies that involve scuba diving somehow. And as a nerd, one of the things that I like to do with said movies is keep an eye out for how accurately they actually reflect the real world subject matter that they cover. Now, a lot of movies that involve diving are in fact shark horror movies, which usually have like a coincidental relationship with reality at best. But there's still often some interesting elements that I like to pay attention to. So today we are going to take a look at the recent shark movie Under Paris and the realism or lack thereof of its scuba diving related scenes. So if you're not familiar with it, this is a 2024 produced film. It was made in France with a French cast and crew and is in French, although it is available with English subtitles on Netflix. In French, the title was Sous la Seine, or Under the Seine. In English, it's Under Paris. As some folks on Reddit have pointed out, it should have been called Shark de Triomphe. But the basic plot is that a huge mutated shark has swum up the Seine River to Paris, where it is lurking in the Seine River and in the flooded catacombs under the city, breeding and occasionally eating people, while the government of Paris is trying to clean up the Seine to prepare for a major international triathlon whose swimming section is being held in the waters of the Seine. And that, by the way, is one little nugget of sort of truth at the core of the movie, because in 2024, the French government did spend a tremendous amount of time and effort cleaning up the Seine River so that they could hold the swimming events of the 2024 Olympics in the river, which they did. Anyway, I don't want to make this a straight up movie review. Your tastes may vary. I have a pretty low bar for what I expect from a shark horror movie. For me, Under Paris met that bar and cleared it by a significant margin. I found it a really entertaining film. I liked it. The ending is rather bizarre, but there are elements of the ending that are really cool. I thought the cast did a really quite good job. The CGI isn't perfect, but it's pretty darn good. Like, this is not a sci-fi original. This is a proper real movie. Anyway, there are two major scenes in the film that I want to talk about because they are specifically addressing, they involve technical diving subject matter. The first of these scenes is actually in the very opening scene of the movie. It takes place out in the Pacific Ocean in the Great Garbage Patch, which is really beautifully represented. I don't know that it's accurately represented, but man, they do a really good job of making it a catching visual set piece. Anyway, there's a team of biologists out there who are trying to hit a particular shark that they've been trailing with a biopsy dart because they think it's mutating. They all get eaten by the shark, as one might expect, with the exception of one woman who is on the dive boat who decides to jump in and do it herself after her entire team has been murdered by this shark. At any rate, she jumps into the water without any scuba gear and without any fins, just with a knife, a weight belt, a mask, and a snorkel, and ends up getting snagged on a net that's caught on the shark's tail. The shark freaks out. The shark just swims, balls out straight down, and she gets dragged down in the water and survives, which is not realistic. Let's just straight up, like, she would not have survived that, but not really for the reasons that I see people saying. So she's free diving here. She's like, there's no decompression issue really going on. What happens is she gets dragged down really far before she has the presence of mind to pull out her knife and cut this rope or net off of her foot that's entangling her to the shark. Once that happens, she is then able to swim back up to the surface. The problem is she's shown getting pulled pretty darn deep and screaming the whole way down, which she does not appear to have the presence of mind to be able to then hold whatever remaining breath she has long enough to make her ascent without any fins. It's interesting, they actually show her eardrums rupturing as she goes down, which wouldn't necessarily happen. Like, this is just free diving. If she'd been able to clear her ears as she went down, like, the pressure, even as far down as they show her going, wouldn't actually be a physiological problem. People can free dive to remarkably deep depths, and you don't end up with like exploding lungs or decompression issues because all of your air was breathed in at the surface. So when you go really, really deep, all the air in your lungs is just compressed into a very small volume, and when you get back to the surface, it re-expands back to just normal lung volume. That's why, you know, freedivers can go hundreds and hundreds of feet deep. The problem is they've got fins and really good presence of mind and really good breath control, and they're generally not being dragged down that depth under surprise and screaming all of the air out of their lungs as they go down. So that's the first issue. I see a lot of commentary online talking about how this person would have died from the pressure or something, and that's just not the case, but she would not have actually made it. One of the things that occurred to me when I first watched the movie was I thought, like, they show the divers in these full face masks that are illuminated on the inside, and to me they just didn't look like real masks, and I thought this was a sign of it being like all CGI or somehow done. It just didn't seem real. On doing some research, I discovered that the full face masks that they show are actually real. They're made by a British company, and they were specifically chosen for the film because they have a particularly large surface area, a really big unobstructed front pane of glass, or polymer, I expect, that makes it really easy to see the actor's face through the mask. And they also have side panels, side windows over here that allow you to see the actor's face from, you know, from angles and not just front on. So that actually made a lot of sense. They chose real masks that allowed them to get good camera angles. Of course, if you have a traditional regulator and snorkel style mask, it's suboptimal for a dramatic film because it gets hard to identify people. You can't see facial features nearly as well. So you put on a good, big, clear, full face mask, and it's much better for filming. What they then did was have a French film lighting company design and build this little rig that clamps onto the outside of the mask and has a couple of soft lights shining into the mask, which is something that would be super annoying to actually dive with because it's like driving at night with all of the lights, the cabin lights in your car on. But again, for filming, it looks great because it lights up the actor's face so you can see expressions and see who people are. You can actually see that rig in just a couple of the short little scenes in the film every once in a while. Beyond that, all the dive gear looked pretty reasonable to me. Everything was done in wetsuits. There were no dry suits, which actually seems okay. The Seine is warm enough for wetsuits some of the time of the year and pretty darn cold other times of the year. I think we can kind of let that one pass. But there's a scene towards the very end of the film that is by far the most technical diving scene. And so if you really want to avoid spoilers, skip this part till after you've seen the movie. But essentially, they need to blow up all the sharks. The sharks are in this underground underwater cavern that they can only access through a part of the Parisian catacombs. Now, in reality, the Parisian catacombs do not have water this deep. They also don't have big open, like cathedral-like chambers the way that you see in the film. In fact, researching this led me down a whole series of rabbit holes, which ultimately led me to a French short film produced about a guy who does dive in submerged sections of the Parisian catacombs. And he's anonymous guy, just goes by the name plongeur, which means diver in French, and was in a video, a little 8-minute professional short movie about this stuff, which I will link to in the description, and you should watch it because it's actually quite interesting and really well made. Anyway, there's a scene where they very specifically run through a dive plan before they execute the dive, which is cool. Like, that's how it ought to be done. It's, of course, plot-wise, it's a way for them to explain what they're about to do so that you know what you're watching. But they're going to start in this underground chamber. They're going to dive 30 meters down, so it's 100 feet down, and then there's a 20-meter tunnel that they're going to go through, so about 60 feet, before they get to this underground, underwater chamber where all the sharks are. They're going to lay explosive charges in there, and then there's an 80-meter tunnel that takes them up and out to the Seine. And it's interesting that they incorporate technical elements here of like actually considering depth and decompression and time underwater, but they don't do it right, which is kind of funny. So during the planning, one of the guys, they say it's 30 meters deep, so decompression will be essential. but it's not. Like 100 feet, you can do like no deco dives just fine. This isn't going to be a particularly long dive. They don't have a whole lot of bottom time. They're going down, planting some blocks of explosive with a detonator, and then they're going to hit the detonator and swim out. Once they hit the detonator, they have 3 minutes to make it out the tunnel. And that's maybe the bigger problem. One guy says, well, that's suicide. We won't have enough time to decompress. But you don't need any time to decompress. All you have to do is come up, you come up at the 1 foot every 2 seconds sort of safe ascent rate. They could then actually do, if they wanted, a safety or decompression stop in the Seine, which is going to be 15 or 20 feet deep where they come out. You actually see a shot of that in the movie. Like after they come out the tunnel and they're safe from the explosion, or mostly safe from the explosion, they could deco in the river if they needed to, but they don't actually need to do any decompression for a short 100-foot dive. The second problem that comes in this is when they actually set off the explosives. There's a very dramatic scene where half the team gets eaten by sharks while they're trying to set up the explosives. The last two are making their way out, and they're just barely getting out of there in time, and the explosion goes off right behind them, and it just tumbles them through in this wave. And the reality of that scene is they both would have been essentially turned into chunky salsa internally had they been that close to that explosion underwater. I, again, did some nerdy rabbit hole explorations on this and ended up finding a table that was derived off of US Navy, not so much experiments, but US Navy experience with internal injuries from underwater explosions, largely during World War II. And the reality is, if we take a look at this chart, I would estimate there was about 10 pounds of TNT. They had like 4 blocks of explosive. If we assume it's about 10 pounds, that's about 5 kilos. So that would put us about here on the chart. But then they were really, really close to the explosion. And you can see it clearly in one of the shots. They are 10 meters from that explosion, 30 feet from where the charges detonate. They're clearly still in the same main room. They haven't gotten into this escape tunnel yet. And if we plot where 10 meters distance gets us on this chart, it is at or below the 50% likelihood of fatalities line, according to the US Navy's understanding of underwater explosion hazard. And in reality, the one guy's kind of dazed when he comes out of the water, and the girl's just fine and goes back in and does a bunch of other stuff. They both would have been extremely lucky to survive that explosion incapacitated. And in reality, they both would have just died in that explosion. Like, that would have knocked wouldn't have knocked their regulators out because they were wearing full face masks, which is, I didn't talk about near explosions being a value of full face masks in my full face mask video, but it does apply here. At any rate, they would have had massive injuries, particularly to the lungs and to the gastrointestinal tract. Those are the 2 parts of the human body that tend to have actual gases in them and are most susceptible to underwater pressure waves and damage. So the rest of the diving is pretty decent. The gear all looks pretty good. Most of the rest of the movie takes place at really quite shallow depths. They're in the river, that kind of thing, where often when you have massive problems with physics and diving, it's because a movie's taking place in some sort of underwater science structure that's 300 meters below the surface, or stuff like that, where they're at really serious depths. This movie had very little in the way of depth. I shouldn't say that. Very little in the way of water depth. So less opportunity to do things really wrong with scuba stuff. Anyway, if you haven't seen the movie, check it out. I thought it was a fun movie. Don't go in expecting the world's greatest cinema, but it's fun. It's a nice way to relax if you like that kind of monster horror movie. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.